Our team of astronauts received a terrifying radio transmission, and I was too afraid to reveal that the message had been following me since I was a child. You will die in circles and circles and circles and circles. NASA received that message on January 4, 2015. The signal was deformed and fuzzy due to distance, yet spoken in perfect English. This excited every other scientist entrusted with such classified information, but it terrified me. You see, I'd heard that exact recording when I was a child. 22 years earlier, those 11 words had buzzed through the speakers of my bedside radio alarm, startling me awake. Worse still, I was a 7-year-old boy hearing that garbled and metallic voice for the first time, but it somehow sounded disquietingly familiar. I'd never heard it before, yet I had. I tried to assure myself that my alarm clock had simply malfunctioned and switched itself onto a strange frequency, some late-night radio station. But I didn't buy that. I knew it was a message. A message meant for me. Now, if that had been an isolated incident, perhaps I would have come to tell myself that the entire ordeal had just been a child's convincing dream, but the horror didn't stop there. It was at high school that I first noticed them. The circles, marked in pen on paper, graffiti on brickwork, and scuffed dirt tracks on the football field. Day after day, those menacing shapes followed me. There was a certain jaggedness to the line work. It felt, to me, as if the circles had been drawn with the utmost contempt and fury, again, a fury directed at me. I developed a phobia of these pursuing omens. Perhaps that was why, a few years later, I chose to study physics at Oxford University. I wanted a rational and soothing explanation grounded in reality. Something to debunk the supposed supernaturalism of these signs. My desire to explain the universe took me overseas. Following the earning of my doctorate in 2010, I secured a NASA internship in the US, and I was more than happy to flee my home. I foolishly thought I'd be leaving the nightmares behind, but they hadn't even started yet. During a lecture with my fellow NASA interns, a short man in a long, black dress stood at the front of the hall. His back was turned, his eyeballs were mere millimeters away from the blank chalkboard, and he was, most amusingly, reading nothing at all on the surface before him. I started chuckling and turned to the coursemate beside me, my closest friend, Dr. Penley. "This lecturer seems a little out of his depth, don't you think?" I teased. Penley raised an eyebrow. "What lecturer? Sorry I'm late, everyone," a woman loudly announced as she hurried down the stairs. When my gaze returned to the front of the hall, I was startled to find the short man in the black dress no longer there. Of course, my scientific mind was, as ever, somewhat capable of dismissing that. Must have just been an intern messing around before taking his seat, I thought, but a part of me, the silly, primitive part, I tried to assure myself, remained unconvinced. "Take notes," the lecturer instructed when she reached the chalkboard. "I'll be speaking quickly." I turned to my left to search for my notebook, and I screeched at an impossibility beside me. Sitting there, in a black dress, was that short man. And I don't know how long it took for me to process the worst part. He had no face. No, that isn't quite right. He had a face. A swirling mass of peach that was reconfiguring itself, dividing endlessly into separate wriggling, stringy shapes. Dividing at great speed, for it was all over in a flash. A blink later, his very form collapsed into itself, but when I looked down at the seat, there was nothing. Not even a discarded dress left behind. "Harrow," Penley began tentatively, placing a hand on my shoulder. I looked up, and all eyes in the lecture theater were on me. Fortunately, that little outburst was quickly forgotten by the other interns, but my condition only worsened over the years. I couldn't escape the terror, that knowledge that an inescapable force followed. I felt this most strongly when applying for NASA's astronaut training program in 2012. The interviewer, Dr. Becker, was a kind man that I already knew from my internship, a burly fellow with graying hair and a slight overbite. I think it important to stress that I'd known him for 2 years, for he wasn't himself on this particular day. "Thank you, sir," I said at the end of the interview, shaking his hand. His grip was ice cold, and it tightened, kept tightening. I felt the joints in my fingers snap and pop. "Ow, that's a little too." "Sir, stop. It never stops," Becker muttered in a voice his own, yet distorted, as if not spoken from lips, but transmitted from the cheap speakers of my childhood radio. "Sir?" I repeated in a fearful whisper. Then the interviewer's fingers let go, and he rattled his head, as if re-entering the room. "Sorry, what was that, Harrow?" I was a million miles away. Before starting my full-time career at NASA, I paid a visit to my family back in England and recounted the strange interview. My mother and father said nothing. They both fixed their eyes on their plates and continued tucking into their meals. "Don't you think that was a weird interaction?" I asked. Mr. Becker's voice became so cold, static, and robotic. Mom finished quietly. I widened my eyes. "Yes." "Not again," Dad sighed, still not lifting his eyes from his plate. Mom had finally met my gaze, only to offer me a look of pity. "What does Dad mean by organ?" I asked her. Fright started to ooze through the cracks of her motherly veneer, and this triggered a long repressed memory. Not again. This horror began before that message on my childhood alarm clock in 1993. On an ordinary school day in an ordinary classroom, there had sounded a crackle at my side, a noise akin to that prickly, unpleasant frequency between radio stations. When I twisted to look out of the window beside me, my top lip started to quiver. A man had been standing beneath the willow tree. A man whose form felt just as prickly and unpleasant and indistinctive as the crackle emanating from him. Still, even as an adult, I remembered one feature: those narrow, level lips. Lips which stared at me as much as lips can stare at a person. Lips which waited patiently. Lips which had parted to reveal his prominent teeth. The stranger's overbite had been slight, yet simultaneously severe. It didn't hang over the bottom lip. The upper teeth simply protruded several centimeters past the lower row, which sat in the shade of those gleaming top whites. The man hadn't been smiling or even frowning, and there was something disconcerting about that. About the neutrality of his mouth. About the simple presence of it. It was absolute, much like the man. The unstoppable man. The Buckman, my 7-year-old self had crudely called him, on account of his teeth. "I remember," I whispered. "The man with the overbite and the horrible voice. Like a voice from the radio, you used to say," Mom softly replied, stretching a hand across the dining table and taking mine. "I'd forgotten all about him," I whispered. "Because it was just a child's imagination running wild," Dad huffed. "You were always an anxious boy." "Jim, don't be so cruel," Mom scolded, before turning back to me. "Sweetie, your interview must have awakened forgotten childhood trauma. You linked Dr. Becker's teeth to the teeth of that horrid stranger from your childhood. What about the way he spoke to me?" I asked incredulously. "I know what I heard. Trauma can do strange things," Mom whispered. The doubt in my mother's voice was undeniable. The fear was undeniable, and I should have taken that seriously. Above all else, I shouldn't have returned to America. Shouldn't have taken the position on the astronaut training program. 3 years later, in 2015, that fateful radio transmission was received by NASA's encrypted system. "You will die in circles, and circles, and circles, and circles." 11 awful words. Words that Dr. Solana told us came from the center of the universe. This classified detail was the revelation that broke all those in the debriefing room for the IRIS-10 mission. Like the dozen or so others in that room, I experienced an existential crisis. Many of us had believed the universe to be infinite, without a center. Beheld by science's public eye, the observable universe is 93 billion light-years in diameter. I now know that this has always been an infinitesimal pocket of a universe tremendously large, yet flat and finite. That may seem like an impossibility, but NASA's publicly available research and technology pales in comparison to the scientific projects developed by Dozen Minus, an undocumented international agency whose whistleblowers have, in the past, earned terrible fates for leaking confidential information. I'm sure I will soon join them, but that's okay. We all be in circles. Following the interception of this extraterrestrial radio signal, Dozen Minus fast-tracked the development of the Iris-10 spacecraft. Within a matter of months, NASA was able to send a manned mission of astronauts to the source of the transmission, trillions upon trillions of light-years away. Send us to that impossible center of reality, at an impossible speed of travel. It was projected that we would reach the signal within 5 years. The Iris-10 team comprised of Captain Becker, Dr. Gleason, Dr. Penley, and me, Dr. Harrow. Hubris drove our team onwards as we warped faster than light into the chest of space. A place which, we were warned, might challenge all that even the advanced scientists of Dozen Minus knew about the laws of physics and reality. Still, if this were a forbidden crevice of space, we assumed that something would stop us from reaching it. Assumed that reality's beating heart would fortify its cosmic valves and vessels against our tiny spaceship, a viral infection. In other words, none of us thought much of Dr. Solana's cautionary briefing. We were pioneers. If anything, Solana only emboldened us to push farther. Even when all signs started to point towards something being wrong. We spent the majority of the journey in cryostasis, so I wouldn't be able to speak of the countless galaxies through which we traveled. The crew was only woken by the ship's artificial intelligence when Iris-10 crossed over what Captain Becker described as a deep, dense threshold between the outer layer of reality, which abides by the known laws of physics, and this inner layer of reality, which could, for all we know, abide by no laws at all, he explained, nodding out of the viewport. Dr. Harrow will confirm the ship's analysis, I'm sure, once he's analyzed the data. But this is it, everyone. We're treading where no other human has been before. I sense that the graying captain was just as lost and unsure of himself as us. Of course, for minds like ours, that's always part of the thrill. Penley rubbed his head. I might need some painkillers, Dr. Becker. Gleason, she corrected. Things will get confusing if you don't use my maiden name to differentiate between the captain and me. You wouldn't want me flying the ship, and you certainly wouldn't want that oaf manning the medical bay. Hey! The gray-haired captain chuckled, elbowing his wife. Sorry, Penley said. I'm just so used to calling you both Dr. Becker. Well, learn quickly, young'un, Gleason teased, sharing a smirk with her husband. We're going to have to babysit these two, aren't we? We are Manpa of the ship, or perhaps more Grandma and Grandpa, Captain Becker added as Gleason laughed and playfully shoved him. 4 years, 7 months, and 15 days, I said, ignoring the comments at my expense as I scanned the data on my screen. We were out for so long. Sure were. We crossed the threshold about an hour ago, Captain Becker said, nodding at the viewport. 1 hour and 17 minutes ago, Iris, the ship's onboard AI, announced from overhead speakers. I ran safety diagnostics before waking the crew 22 minutes ago. Take a look out there, Harrow, Captain Becker said. What do you see? I saw a blackness in which there were no stars, in which the laws of time and space might not even apply, according to the scientists back home. Home, I thought. I wonder how home looks after 4 years. Nearly 5. It might not even exist anymore. Might have been wiped clean by a comet or nuclear weapons. I shook my head and tried to focus. Something about the dark of that place at the center of our universe, which we would come to call the middle, instilled me with the emptiest thoughts, or rather, emptied out my old thoughts and put something else in their place. Something terrifying. I see nothing, I eventually answered, eyes still glued to the screen at my station. And neither does the ship. No stars. No planets. No known elements. The data reads that. Well, I don't know what it reads. There's just nothing here. Nothing that our physical instruments are able to process. It seems impossible that our ship even managed to cross over into a place that sits beyond or within our known reality. Not like it hasn't been done by NASA before, Becker said, but that's beyond your clearance. Doesn't make it any less impossible, I replied. I think impossible is a word that we'll soon struggle to comprehend, Penley whispered. The captain continued. Anyway, my point is that it makes no sense to talk about years and months and days. Yes, Iris says we crossed some sort of threshold an hour ago, but what do we really know about spatial and temporal laws in this place? The only physical data NASA has ever received from this pocket of the universe is the radio transmission. Becker was right, and he only seemed righter as time passed, if it were even passing at all. I only know that we didn't eat, didn't sleep, didn't want for anything other than moving ever forwards. This was, at first, a scientist's dream, to experience something no other human has ever experienced. However, our early intrigue quickly mutated into existential fear as we contemplated the connotations of our bodily changes. Our new states of being contradicted all that an ape brain understands about survival, about the fundamental nature of life itself. Something about the darkness seemed to change our minds too. Penley and I began as the bubbly and, as Dr. Gleason had pointed out, young members of the crew, but we quickly fell into contemplative silence. Fearful silence. It was Captain Becker alone who maintained an eager glint in his eyes. What finally broke up the darkness beyond the viewport was a sea of white debris. Jagged, misshapen chunks of various sizes floated through the middle. Silent awe and wonder gave way to fear as we saw, printed across many of those scattered metal shards, an impossible chunk of text. It was repeated dozens of times across dozens of identical debris pieces. Iris 10. We were staring at the impossible debris of our own spacecraft, countless copies of our spacecraft lost in that black oblivion. What is this? Gleason murmured in horror. Time, the captain murmured, watching the white clunks clattering against the outer hull of our spacecraft in fascination. Dr. Solana warned us that time is different in this place. What the crap is that supposed to mean? Penley asked. Those are pieces of our vessel. How are they out there? We need to turn back, I whispered, abandoning my scientific curiosity as a clamminess coated my flesh like the many traumatic times that I'd witnessed something bigger and more terrible than me during my childhood. We can't turn back, Harrow, Captain Becker explained. We're being pulled towards something. Then came the blare of an alarm, an obnoxious, deafening klaxon. Damage inflicted upon airlock door, Iris announced in her calm, stilted, artificial voice from overhead. She and Captain Becker were alike in their unsettling nonchalance towards the situation. The clunks against the outer hull, which had started as patters like that of light raindrops, were growing in loudness, growing in ferocity as the spacecraft started to judder from side to side, lamenting the turbulence. The debris field was beating relentlessly against the ship. Captain, Gleason bellowed, shaking her husband by the shoulders. Becker shook his head, as if waking up a little, as if understanding, at last, the gravity of the situation. Dr. Penley. Yes, Captain. Someone help me suit up, and I'll get out there, Penley replied, cutting off the captain as he turned on his heel to head out of the control room. You're not serious? I scoffed, running after my friend. The two of us made it down the main walkway and stopped in front of the airlock. Dr. Penley. I began firmly as the man started pulling a spacesuit from the storage compartment by the airlock. We know nothing about what's out there. He slipped a helmet over his head. Captain Becker, do you copy? Yes, Becker replied, voice sounding over the ship's speakers. I'm decreasing our speed, bringing us to a crawl so you don't get ripped off into the abyss. Captain, I shouted, spinning to face the control room at the end of the walkway. Don't let him do this. We don't know whether his suit will be able to withstand. We won't be able to withstand a damaged airlock, Becker interrupted, voice verging on something other than calm. Dr. Penley, go and inspect the situation. You don't have to do this, I breathlessly said as my friend opened the first door. He tapped on a screen within the airlock, then sealed himself in there. Oh crap. No kidding? All right, Harrow. You get your butt out there and use my engineering qualification as toilet paper on the way out, Penley replied, grinning at me through the visor of his helmet. Look, the sooner I fix whatever's broken, the sooner I stop us from dying excruciatingly. I winced as my friend opened the outer airlock door, expecting an onslaught of white debris to flood the airlock and shred his body. But as Penley stepped into the black on his spacewalk, the fragments of our cloned ship seemed to glide softly past him. Feels weird out here, the engineer commented as he clung to the side of the vessel, fiddling with the control panel beside the airlock door. Weird in what way? Gleason replied over the ship's comms. My friend chuckled. He seemed more like himself, as if welcoming the distraction, welcoming something within the realms of science. Something that he understood. Penley? Captain Becker pressed. Sorry, I was just. My friend paused, collecting himself. Any of you ever twisted an ankle? Sprained something? Sure, I replied, speaking into the microphone by the airlock door. Penley sighed contentedly. Well, it feels like that. There's a tightness to my skin, across my entire body. Penley, are you okay? Gleason asked with a hint of concern in her voice. He's fine, her husband promised. How's the airlock looking, Penley? Iris was panicking over nothing, the engineer explained. There's a dent near the opening mechanism, but the door opened with ease. Nothing major has been damaged. Nothing has been breached. Right, well, let's get you back inside then, I said. Requesting a few more minutes out here, Captain, Penley pleaded in an unnervingly hushed tone. It's too colorful to leave just yet. A rainbow of color. What? Gleason asked from the control room. We're just seeing white out here, Penley. Captain, please order him to get back inside. I yelled into the microphone, clammy skin worsening by the second. Nothing felt right about this. Are you sure everything's operational, Penley? Becker asked. Yes, sir, the astronaut replied in a serene voice. I'd never, in the 5 years I'd known him, heard Penley sound so dim, so lacking in that usual passion and excessiveness and luster for life. Since crossing the threshold, however, he'd changed. Any glimpses of his true self were becoming fewer by the minute. First, he became uncharacteristically quiet. Then, he became uncharacteristically calm. I'd preferred it when he wasn't saying anything. If everything has been assessed, come back inside and reseal the airlock, Captain Becker ordered. Yes, sir, Penley replied, floating back into view. He swam through the airlock opening, then slammed his fist against a large gray button, and the door closed behind him. The astronaut's white boots clattered clumsily to the floor, and he smiled at me through the visor of his helmet as he opened the second airlock gate. It was a warm smile, comfortingly familiar. He seemed back to his old self. Amazing, Penley sighed as he removed his helmet and the inner door closed behind him. What did you mean out there? I asked quietly, almost too afraid to do so. A rainbow of color. My friend simply shrugged, but continued smiling. That was when I realized he hadn't returned to his old self at all. There was something utterly dreadful about Penley's demeanor, and what frightened me so much was the fact that I didn't know how he'd changed. There was more to it than a calm disposition. How are you feeling, Dr. Penley? Gleason asked as she entered the walkway. How's your skin feeling now? Still tight? It feels rejuvenated, actually, He laughed, squishing his face with a gloved hand. Better than ever. Well, just to be sure, I'd like to give you a checkup in the med bay, Gleason said, heading off down the corridor. I'll go and get set up. The grinning engineer simply nodded as he removed his suit. Are you okay? I whispered once he'd removed the headgear and our conversation wasn't been broadcast over the ship's comms. I just said so, didn't I? Penley replied, stretching wide and letting out a large yawn. Man, I feel brand new, and that was when my heart skipped momentarily out of rhythm. He looked brand new. We were both men in their late 20s whose aging processes had been halted by cryostasis, but this was more than halted aging. It was reversed aging. Penley was 27 years old when we left Earth, and the man had started to gray a little on the sides, had a little ruggedness to his skin too. However, following the spacewalk, his brunette locks looked closer to the color they'd been when we both joined NASA's internship program in 2010. There wasn't a drop of white in the brown. Moreover, his face looked smooth again. Babyish. All lines and ridges had been ironed out. Better get this medical appointment checked off then, Penley sighed, turning on his heel and following Gleason. Harrow, Captain Becker announced over the speakers. Report to the control room for an updated data reading, please. I begrudgingly returned to the front of the ship, desperate for Dr. Gleason to give me a medical checkup too, to tell me that my eyes were deceiving me. That Penley hadn't de-aged. Instead, I spent 10 minutes poring over the data about our surroundings in the middle. The chunks of space debris, still the only physical readings other than that distant radio signal, were starting to clear. We were returning to the black and nothingness. We'll be able to pick up some speed again in a few million light years, I told the captain. We've almost cleared the debris field. Captain Becker nodded, and he inhaled deeply, as if on the precipice of saying something, of revealing some great truth that he had learned from looking out at the nothingness for longer than the rest of us. Looking out for too long, perhaps. But then came a panicked voice over the speakers. Captain and Harrow to the med bay, she wailed. I don't understand. Becker and I abandoned our stations, dashed down the walkway, then scurried through an automatic door into Gleason's station. What the? I began, gasping at the sight before me. A pale-faced Dr. Gleason was sitting beside her blue operating table, on which a very content Dr. Penley was lying, interlocking fingers resting peacefully atop his belly. His black sleeves had been rolled up to stop them hanging loosely over the ends of his hands, and his oversized trousers had rucked up to the tops of his oversized shoes. Penley had continued aging backwards. He was shrinking. It was, by his face, unmistakably him, but he looked like a young adolescent, maybe 13 years of age. I don't. Gleason repeated, staring blankly at the wall, as if unwilling to meet Penley's gaze, unwilling to accept the existence of the scientific impossibility before her. We have to stop it. Somehow, we have to stop this before he. The de-aging was slow, but noticeable. With it, there came a sound that filled me with terror. The squeaking of grinding surfaces, as if Penley were made of rubber. I thought of his comment about the tightness of his skin. Thought of his comment about a rainbow of color. Thought of the new personality which didn't belong to him. What happened to you? I murmured in horror, watching my friend become a child of maybe 9 or 10 years old. And then his smile faded, as if he'd actually heard me, actually regained his true mind. However, that was the most horrifying part. He no longer looked content with his fate, content with his youth. There came a sense of knowing in my friend's eyes, and he looked down at the oversized sleeves hanging across his arms and the shoes slipping off his tiny feet. What is happening to me? He croaked with childlike innocence, as if his brain were de-aging too. Help me. Gleason placed a hand on the boy's cheek lovingly, tears filling her eyes. We will help you, Penley, I lied, trying to hide my fearful gaze from his. I promise. Oh, we're going to. Gleason trailed off, mine seeming to lose its already tenuous grasp on reality. "We need to turn back," I said. "If we get him out of the middle, maybe the normal laws of physics will apply to him. Maybe he'll start aging the right way again." "It would take us 4 hours to return to the threshold," Captain Becker said. "In the space of 10 or 15 minutes, Dr. Penley has already de-aged from a man to a boy. He won't make it. He'll keep de-aging until—" "Don't," his teary-eyed wife warned. "Don't say it. It might stop if we put him in cryostasis," I suggested. "The natural laws don't apply here," Becker said. "We have to try," I begged. "It's out of our hands," the captain whispered, eyes as distant as they had been since we crossed over the threshold. "We're being pulled towards the center now." Gleason eyed her husband in horrified confusion. "What are you even saying?" "Huh?" Becker replied absent-mindedly, revealing that he might perhaps have been the least calm and centered out of us all. "Being pulled towards the center," his wife barked. "What do you mean?" Penley, who now looked close to being a toddler, interrupted by shrieking in terror. "I don't want to die." Then the de-aged man tore off his trousers and jumped down from the bed in his oversized shirt, worn like a dress. The 3 remaining adults stared at the boy with dumbfounded expressions as he pelted out of the med bay and down the walkway. "I'll get him," I promised, twisting and running off in pursuit. I expected Penley to find a quiet corner of the ship to sit down and cry. Expected that he would have become a toddler by the time I'd reached him. But my eyes widened as I heard the wispy hiss of a gate opening. And then the child form of Penley, wearing only that oversized shirt, scurried into the airlock. "Penley, no!" I screamed at the top of my lungs. I reached the inner gate a moment after it shut, and I was about to slam the button to reopen it, but Penley was quick. With childlike nimbleness, he'd already opened the outer door. There came a moment of silence and stillness. The boy did not float out into the black, did not freeze and discolor and shatter. After all, we were not in space. We were in a different place with different rules. Perhaps Penley had glimpsed more of the truth than us, but even he didn't understand. He clearly thought something in the black or the unseen rainbow would save him, would reverse his de-aging fate. "That's better," I heard him whisper, voice inexplicably audible through the inner gate even without headgear. Captain Becker and Dr. Gleason were running down the walkway towards me as I banged furiously on the airlock door. "Don't you dare go near that button, Harrow," Becker warned me, yelling as he sprinted forwards. The captain tore me backwards, and the 3 of us watched in stunned silence as the toddler, exposed to the black beyond the open airlock, turned to face the oval window of the inner gate. Then came a terror I will never scrub from my eyes. Penley's oversized shirt dropped to the metallic floor of the airlock, and out poured a dozen giant, fleshy worms of various blues, reds, yellows, and greens. A nightmarish kaleidoscope of writhing shapes that had once been my friend. As the surviving crew members screamed, the creatures crawled along the walls and floor and ceiling of the airlock, and some of them started to coat the other side of the window. And just as I begged the nightmare to relent, so as to let my heart rest, horrid slits opened in the heads of the worms. They moved their small jaws in unison to mouth words as a single voice. "What's wrong?" it asked. "Why are you all looking at me that way?" "I feel better." I didn't blink, didn't move, didn't speak. Just thought one word. Penley. It was still Penley. Those creatures had assumed my dear friend's consciousness. It was as if he were their unwilling and unknowing hive mind. Penley was unaware that he hadn't become better at all. He or it began to cry, disturbed by our continued screaming. "Please, stop it. Just open the door for me. I can't seem to understand how to press the button," he continued in a frightened voice. Then, as the worms fiddled with the panel on the other side of the inner door, there came a flurry of sparking sounds. "Run!" I roared. As those worm-like abominations fried the mechanism, Captain Becker seized his wife's arm, pulling the two of them after me as we fled towards the control room. We were not immediately torn out into the blackness of the middle, but I feared a worse fate, having seen what that unholy space did to Penley. I made it to the control room first and stood by the door in fear, watching as the unholy worm bow spiraled around the inside of the hallway, chomping at the heels of the escaping Becker and Gleason. The creatures were squealing in horror, slits undulating as one. Penley was only pursuing us out of misunderstanding, out of sorrow that his once friends were abandoning him. Whatever the case, I wasn't going to let that thing reach us. As Becker and Gleason slipped through the door, I slammed the button to lock us safely inside the control room. "Ah," Gleason winced, looking behind her. Is there a... "I don't." "You're fine," Becker panted, inspecting the back of his wife. "None of them got you. None of them got inside. What was that thing?" "Don't play stupid now," I growled. "That was Dr. Penley, the man you sentenced to his death. I told you that he shouldn't go out there, that we should have turned back as soon as the alarm sounded. We had to push onwards," the captain said blankly, returning to his dashboard and looking out at the thinning debris. "Penley's sacrifice wasn't for nothing. We've almost reached the signal. They're still out there," Gleason whimpered, shivering as she scratched her skin, seemingly still convinced that a worm had slipped inside without her noticing. That was when I noticed it. The doctor's gray locks of hair had started to reduce in number, had started to be overrun by blondes, and the wrinkles on her face seemed fewer in number. She had to be a woman in her late 50s, but she looked like she de-aged a decade already. She touched him, I thought, recalling Gleason stroking Penley's face in the med bay. As I started to back away from her slowly, the doctor noticed and offered me a frown. What are you?" she began. But Gleason didn't need to ask the question. She already knew. I saw it in her eyes. She'd felt the tightness of her skin, like that of a sprain. That was why she'd been scratching so feverishly at her flesh. "Oh God," she cried, clutching her face in both hands. The captain was captivated by something outside. "Look, it's amazing." Gleason shivered. "Captain, just look," he moaned, eyes still not moving away as he thrust his index finger at the viewport. The three of us stared ahead to see that we had emerged from the sea of white debris, after minutes or years, and entered a void of swirling colors, raging reds and yellows, twirling inwards and converging on a white center point. That point made me feel off-center. It was a white somehow more terrifyingly absent and unfixed than the black of space. Worse, even, than the black of the middle. "Don't look at it," Captain Becker finally whispered, a tear in his eye. "You'll never see anything else again." "You told us to look," I screamed, instantly looking away. I felt a slight itch in my eye, as if there were a strand of hair in it, and I wrestled, tried desperately to get it out. "Becker, please," Gleason sobbed, dropping the formality as she fell to her knees. Once the itch had subsided, or given the illusion of subsiding, I managed to focus on her again. She looked younger than me. Baby-faced and blonde-haired, body starting to look small and meager in her oversized clothes, as had been the case with Penley. "Captain," I began, "I think you should look at your wife." I kept my own gaze on Gleason, mainly to avoid looking at the viewport again. My eyes finally felt looser, felt less as if some wire were tightly coiling itself around them, cutting into my retinas until I would never see anything other than that blinding white ever again. "I love you," Gleason whispered, voice sounding far less husky, far less worn by time. This seemed to startle the captain. Finally, with visible effort, the man peeled his eyes away from the intoxicating center of the universe to look upon his wife. And then he shuddered, released a pained and heartbroken moan. "Sweetheart," he croaked, stumbling towards her. Gleason was an adolescent now, a child in overgrown clothes. Becker finally snapped back into something vaguely resembling human, and he rushed over, before kneeling beside her. "I'm scared," his wife whispered as she became a child again, de-aged from 10 to 9 to 8. "Don't be scared, honey," Becker sobbed, cradling the child shrinking away in her adult clothes. "We'll fix this. We'll take you to the cryostasis chamber. They're still out there," she reminded him in a child's voice, nodding her toddler-sized head at the walkway beyond the control room. The sounds of those worm-like things scratching at the door were still faintly audible. "We wouldn't make it, and I don't want to go into the black. I don't want to become like Penley. Please don't." She suddenly ceased talking. As she became a baby, it seemed that Gleason's vocal cords had either stopped working or her brain had forgotten how to speak, had lost the years of learning necessary to do so. And then came the true horror. Becker scooped the baby out of the shirt, bawling along with her. Bawling as he endured the slow, agonizing, backwards end of his true love. Gleason returned to a fetal state, then into an embryonic one, then into smaller and smaller mounds of being, into cells too small to see. The trembling captain stared at his empty palms. His wife had de-aged into nothing, had ceased to be. I slumped to the floor, as terrified and psychologically shattered as the captain before me. My only glimmer of hope was that the man on the floor had regained his humanity, that he might be human enough to take us home. But then Becker's crying stopped, and he rose to his feet with blank eyes, before returning to the control panel. Returning to looking out of the viewport at the universe's center with longing. "We have to turn back now," I whispered, nodding at the emergency pod affixed to the side of the ship, accessible, fortunately, from the control room. "We have to abandon ship. There's only one way to get her back, Harrow. And it knows that I'll do it," he blubbered. "I'll do anything to bring her back." "She's gone, Becker," I cried, heading towards the emergency hatch. "You need to join me in the escape pod now." "We have no free will," Becker whispered. "We are bits of matter that have been summoned back to their creation point at the beginning, the middle, and the end of the universe. We're here to reboot it all. To fly Iris 10 into that white heart. To contract the universe so it may expand again. It's circular." I slipped quietly into the escape vessel. The door closed, and Becker's voice continued on the overhead speakers as the pod's engine started up. Becker whispered, "This isn't how it ends, Harrow. This is how it starts." "I'm not going to die here, Captain," I said as the escape pod detached. "We already have and will," he replied. "You will die in circles, and circles, and circles, and circles." My chest squeezed. The Buckman. It had always been Captain Becker. And as my escape pod sailed away from Iris 10, which bar-railed towards the white center of the universe, the horrid reds and yellows of the middle tugged and strained, and all contracted, all collapsed towards that ship heading towards the heart of everything. I ran from both the end and the beginning of the universe. I crossed back over the threshold, then found myself returning to Earth in 2025 with an impossible story to tell. I fear mankind's lack of free will. No matter how hard I try, I will experience this torture for all eternity. Will become a child again, haunted by messages, symbols, and pursuing entities, all culminating in a voyage to the middle, where a new Iris 10 spacecraft will be added to that everlasting and ever-growing scrapyard of white debris. We are, and will always be, fated to fly back to the universe's center. Fated to die in circles, and circles, and circles, and circles. I hope you guys like this video. If you did, make sure like, comment, share, and subscribe the channel Mark Stories.